Okay, this is going to be probably a little tough for you to see the board today, but you'll be able to hear, and it should be hopefully fairly clear once we get going. There we are. Wow, it's really happening. Okay, this is going to be probably a little. Let's get rid of that. So now the other person is Dara. Okay. We're advanced but not bowed. Little COVID going on. Little service to the armed forces. And a little. And you can hear me, right, Orla?
Yes.
Orla, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Forget it. So you saw a few Lebanon examples on video, and what that is, Dr. Giselle Wires is one of the choral people at University of Washington School of Music. And she and I have known each other. In fact, Dr. Wires was the director of choral activities at Boise State for about 10 years. And then she went to the University of Washington. And she and I are a couple of the people in the Northwest that were trying to make applications for the Lebanon movement theory to conducting. And you can see that she's taken off with it in terms of a curriculum, because they have a graduate program as well as undergraduate. So there's a system of and hierarchy of conducting classes. And they have a Lebanon specialist, just like we do now, in our own Dr. Cox. But it's a more integrated program, and it goes into the graduate level. But those videos were examples taken from those classes, and specifically intended to show the practical demonstration of this language. Okay, we went through, I know it seems like a long time ago, but we went through what probably seemed like some silly, activities, and imagine doing this, pulling a bow and arrow, doing various resistance activities, which put these effort actions in combinations, and then we use the specific action verbs, which show those, what are the combinations of weight, space, and time, and where on that scale of extremes do they fall in that particular activity. Now, did you see the practical use for them in that video? Probably the answer is yes. You saw some practical, but there's some limitations, aren't there? I think there are some limitations, in my opinion. There are in the videos, particularly between some of the conductors. For example, the idea of floating. If you notice, some of those conductors used almost only the horizontal plane. Right? There was almost no vertical action at all. And I think, to me, some of the activities seemed like, and probably that's what it was for, but they imposed these concepts on some musical structures, rather than where I'd like to go with this, which is what does the music say? What are the characteristics of that piece of music? And then how are they realized visually in our gesture? Rather than, this is how I'm going to move on this particular plane to a musical example that was probably, somewhat contrived for that exercise, right? Because they used a number of musical examples, but if you notice, for example, example one was played differently. There was, deep into the keys, kind of accents, and then a more lyric cantabile was used for the same musical excerpt. And then they used that same musical excerpt, even though there were 4 or 5 different ones, but hopefully you noticed that as well. The sometimes the music itself is changed in order to accommodate the, the specific action verb. So I want to point out the limitations in that, which you're very well aware of, and I think we should limit what I had you watch to see, okay, here's that movement relating to a musical example and how it primarily uses whatever combinations of space, direct, indirect, time, quick and sustained, or weight, heavy or light. So that I think was fairly easy to see. But today I'd like to combine the ideas that we were discussing a long time ago, both Levon and Dalcroze. And the Dalcroze ideas of, how do we as human beings react to a piece of music? And how do we move to that in an organic and a natural way? So, well, I'm not going to ask you to get into your stocking feet and run around the room, which is, I actually took a Dalcroze class many years ago, and that's what we did. We spent afternoons in our stocking feet and listening to music, and that's part of the way in which a Dalcroze specialist presents these concepts, so that, by the time you get into about the second section of this, you have no inhibitions, you don't care what you look like, and everybody in the room looks like they're in kindergarten or younger, and you just start doing the things. And ultimately, that's where we would go if we really wanted to experience this concept. Number one, we don't have the time, and this isn't a Dalcroze class. But the concept is the important thing. And so I'm going to play some music for us. And I'd like you, go ahead and stand. And using the idea of that imaginary shape around us, that imaginary space, the kinesphere, we're going to move within that. And if you want to start off to just feel comfortable in some sort of keeping the pulse or however you want to react to this, I'd like you to stay in your space, but allow your body to move with what you hear. So if this is set up correctly, we'll see. Okay, got it. Now just move Does anybody know what that is? It is Bernstein's first movement of Bernstein's Chichester Psalms. And so it's for orchestra and choir. But now let's do a little bit more directive motions inside the kinesphere. So not that I'm going to tell you how to move, but that the idea is how would you represent those musical sounds, whether you call them as a musician accents, or you call them linear, or whatever attribute we would give them, whatever language, descriptive language you want to use. How would our bodies move? To me, this kind of emotion doesn't seem suitable for that quite angular musical context. So let's try that again. And I'd like you to try, just experiment, let yourself go a bit. Like I said, the self-consciousness at 8:30 in the morning, as you're waking up. I don't want to do this. Oh well, here we go. Whole body. And it's delightful. Moving on. So let's contrast that with this particular selection. Disc skip. There we go. 20th century technology. Come on. There we go. It's rather calming, isn't it? Maybe that's what I need to listen to for the next week. Okay, and then this will be the last example. Or maybe not. Okay, you can see that that's the last of our activity. But if we were to conduct each of those three pieces, we couldn't just make obviously the verse that's not in four, and so there's not a unanimity of meter. But there is definitely a contrast in the way you all moved, in the way that we felt when we heard those scores realized by real performance. And we can analyze meter. For example, the last one's in compound meter. That's a Bach. That's the opening to a Bach cantata. And there's an element that exists in essentially, a 12/8 or a 6/8 that doesn't exist in a 3/4 or a 4/4, right? There's that combination of the beat subdivided and lifted. And so I might, you know, characterize each of those three pieces, each of those musical examples differently, right? So if we talk about our kinesphere, and if we talk about just 1, 2, 3 dimensions, which dimension primarily did the Bernstein feel? How did you feel that? Boom, 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 boom.
More like vertical.
Yeah, I think primarily vertical, and the second piece was a double choir mass in E flat by Reinberger, and so they're just voices. How about that? What? Let me back up and say, none of these exist on only one plane, right? No music is simply vertical, horizontal, or whatever. But primarily, the second one that I said, boy, that's relaxing. It was quite horizontal. I mean, I saw that in all of your motions. I mean, yeah, there was up and down, of course, but compared to the first one, which was quite angular, that one was more suspended. And then the third one, which was Bach, and in a compound meter. What do you think about that? There was vertical, for sure, right? There was horizontal at times. Do you agree? A little bit of impulse and release. And I felt like there was some sagittal as well. And to me, it doesn't have to be Bach, but I do think that a lot of the Baroque composers, a lot of Baroque music has that element. There is 20th century, 21st century music as well that has subdivisions or duplets against triplets that gives it that sense of swivel, right? And so that's how elementary we're discussing here. It's the way we feel in our kinesphere when we move, and that's really what we're talking about as conductors, I think. Because one of the primary things I think that we want to, besides the beat and where that exists in time, is what are the characteristics that you just experienced as a human being? What makes those things work in a particular piece of music? And then how do they look? How should they look at our gesture? Because if, let's say, all three of those pieces, well, I can't even count today, all three of those pieces were in 2, okay? Bum, 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 bum. Bum, ba, dum, bum, ba, dum, bum, ba, da, 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 bum, ba, da, 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 dum, ba, dum, bum, ba. I mean, we could look exactly the same if the sound was off. Although we would see where the beat was. So I guess the point of this entire Lebon philosophical and physical discussion is why not make something look specific within the patterns that we use? And that's the language that's the only use for it in our class and for our discussions. So whatever you might have seen that was a little disturbing to you in those videos, and there were some things I watched that I thought, whoa, there is no obtuse in that. Or, many of the aspects of our technique were not there. And so I don't want to throw all the technique out and say, okay, now let's feel it this way and let's do it that way. But I think you all understand the concept that we're experiencing today with those 3 examples. They are 3 completely different kinds of music, even if they were conducted in the same meter. So let's do a little bit of experimentation with this. Can you all see this exercise on the board? So we're going to use a 4/4 pattern, and we're going to just give and so on. So we'll have a melody gesture in the second bar because we're cutting off and we're breathing. So if we just do this, and you don't talk, I'll do the time for you. Just conduct, okay? Here we go. 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 and then we can hold that out. Okay, so what I like to do is do that same exercise, and so you can concentrate on just doing the gesture. You can use both hands if you want. Let's use the right hand to keep the pattern itself going. I'd like to try each of the 8 using the, as best we can, because all 8 of these action verbs just are not going to fit perfectly with our pattern. But in terms of the use of space, the weight, the idea of the flow or the resistance, and the time. So, and we'll move the time around, and I'll show you what I mean by that in terms of tempo. So let's try float first of all. So, and we'll keep it about 2, 3, about that tempo, okay? 3, 4, ta, 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 okay. So one of the things that I hope you saw in those videos were contrasting tempi. And there were a couple of times when Dr. Wires had 2 students. One did a more moderate or a faster tempo, and one did a more sustained tempo. And tempi will have an impact on, number one, what our metabolism, our inner metabolism has to be, how fast, obviously, or how slowly, or what the time factor is from A to B. How much time do we have? So let's try that same floating idea, and we won't do the whole thing. But let's just start it quite a bit faster. Okay, but still float. It's the idea of float. 2, 3, 4, ta, 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 and so on. So there is a difference in the use of our gesture and in the use of our space when the tempo is faster, slow, or faster or slower. My point here is that if that is if those markings were in the score, like cantabile molto legato, or leggero, or that the composer had written specific indications which said that that's the sort of dynamic or tempo, or that is a tool we have, right? That idea of flow, the concept. I have no concern about you going into the wide world and saying, "Oh, I'm going to float this." That's not the point here. The point here is not to have you go forth. Well, this is what good conducting language is. It's the concept. It's the idea that this language can assist us in being more specific. So what that language helps us to understand in a little different way is that this also has to be where we put this note into play. So this cannot be, if we're using that verb. I mean, that's common sense. Nor can it be. There's no connection then to the sound. There's no information that we're giving our ensemble that gives them any idea about the characteristic of this note. Same thing with the cutoff and the inhalation preparation for this note. So, knowing that, let's breathe together again in a more moderate tempo, meaning let's prepare, be sure that your gesture of preparation is in the character of the first ta. So here we go, 2, 3, 4, ta, if that's what we choose to do, ta. So if there's no crescendo here, and we continue on through with the same dynamic, we're in that one terrace, our release is not going to be huge if this next note is in the same. You get the concept? Okay. So let's look at ring now. This one kind of bugged me in the terms of, I don't know if you felt this way. It was problematic to me watching some of the people who gave this, because this idea of that we use the wheel or we use the towel, to me has kind of specific application. And can you think of a musical, let's say any kind of music that you've ever played that has more than one, or a song or played that's had, you all been in ensembles, so with more than one voice, is there a compositional structure or a contrapuntal structure that you could imagine using this kind of a, not the towel, but the idea of tension release?
I almost think of like when we did Leonardo
Uh-huh.
and his flying machine. There were moments of like great dissonance in the music that then like would release to consonance.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
kinda-
Exactly, and that's even a more sophisticated way of saying suspension release. So if there's a suspension, and then one of the voices suspends a non-harmonic tone over a harmonic one, and the resolution of that tone provides tension, right? So there's tension in the music, and then it releases. So rather than go through, and that's what was disturbing to me about watching that video, is that wouldn't imagine conducting any piece of music in which every note used that concept, right? It's like, did you notice that they kept their hands in sort of a, it just looked like there was tension all the way through. And that's what was troubling to me about that particular example. So to me, some of these, I mean, we're going to use the Levon terminology. There's some times in which they are very specific moments in time where that concept works perfectly. And I think that's one of those, a harmonic structure like a suspension release or a change of harmony, a chromatic line, something in which there is a musical reason for it. So I don't know that this example is the one I want to use it for, but that gives us an idea where we might use it. So glide. If I say the two words, and this is where, you know, I remember being in your position as a student in all my degrees, and when I hear some new concepts, I go, yeah, glide, I'm going to glide. You know, I'm going to flow, or whatever. But if we have to pick between or compare float and glide, the way that you see, well, you don't have your sheet in front of you, no doubt, but glide, for example, has a use of direct space. And that's a, meaning you go directly there. If you skate, if you ski, you go on a straight line. And if you float, the idea is that you don't go directly, right? We're suspended. So that's the difference in the use of the space. And so let's try that. So now we're going to use this Levon term glide, but it's a more direct approach from ictus to ictus. So here we go again. Let's think now, let's imagine that it's important, isn't it, to have a dynamic context. So let's say mezzo forte, okay? And about 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, 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 and so on. We won't have to go all the way through. Faster or slower tempo will change that sense. So do you feel a difference between the first one and the third one that we're talking about? So this idea, so that's practical. Now, we could go press, we could go flick, we could go slash, and I don't want to go through all of them right now, but I want to show that context. Let's take one that is quite different, more like the Bernstein. Let's take the punch, okay? So we use punch so that almost every single beat is more like that. Bong, 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 bong. Okay? So here we go. 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Assuming that what we heard in the Bernstein was present on this music, right? You'd have to, what would you have to have besides what I've got written there? Huh? Accent. You'd have to have some sort of indication of accent. You'd have to have some sort of indication of dynamics. You'd probably have some other Italian, German, French words that the composer had written in there for, maybe something like maestoso or something like that, that gives us some sort of context. But that gives me some musical context in how we would use the space. So now let's give, because the important thing now to go direct to is that no piece of music, unless it's by Philip Glass, or a minimalist who is, John Adams, who has written to control one dynamic, repeating rhythmic figure that goes on and on and on for multiple measures, like dozens of measures, with one note that changes in that entire dozen measures. That's not the typical example, but that is an example we could use, right? I mean, you all know that literature, and if you haven't played it, you've at least heard it. However, most music that we have, even in this, 1, 2, 3, 4 bars, if it's from the Romantic 20th century, 21st century, you could use 6 of these 8 concepts within those 4 bars. And that's the real application to conducting, is the manner in which we are illustrating what is on the printed score. So let's add some help here. We have a molto legato, and we have the dynamic. We have a changing dynamic here. So now we have some specifics. Now we have something that, let's say, the composer has written. So now let's conduct this, okay? Whatever you think, or however you would try to realize that, you don't even have to do it the same way I am. But the point is, let's make a difference in this score. So here we go. We're going to go moderate tempo. 2, 3, 4. So every bar has a different, we could say, if you had to take out of this 8 action verbs, where would you put them? And we're not going to do that because that's not useful. The useful part is seeing the contrast. The useful part is, okay, how does this apply to my conducting, my pattern, my preparation motion to whatever is occurring. Because we're always trying to do a little bit of that. And if I'd like to work on that myself and do it a little bit better. But because then we can get the left hand involved too, so that it's not countermanding what the right hand is doing, at least with dynamics and something else. This now is what we're going to do with America the Beautiful. Okay? So I don't think it's been as clear to you. Oh, I'm just going to make up a bunch of dynamics. Yeah, I'd like you to write in your score something like this in every large phrase. In other words, what are you going to do with the music that we can see in your gesture? And then we're going to start working on that by having you come up here and conduct a choir. And let's say you conduct through it one time. Then you go back and you work on it phrase by phrase, meaning you have to use some verbal comments. So this isn't just, okay, this is all guesswork. We're going to just keep doing it 100 times until people get it. It's bringing the choir, which is what you will do with any ensemble you conduct. You bring them to the score. You bring the group as close to the score as you can, so that from the beginning, we're going to try out whatever you've marked in your gesture and you've integrated inside. And then we'll go back and say, okay, let's go back to measure 1. And let's just go from measure 1 to measure 4, because there's, as many of you know who have rehearsed the group, the human mind remembers about 2 things at once, you know. So rather than going back, you know, and this is what we get into in choral methods. But there's got to be a little methodology, at least in practice, for us to work with a group. And so right out of the gates, when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to get up here and I'm going to articulate something, articulate 1 or 2 things in the period of the sentence, or the period of the sentence, in the sentence or phrase, and have that 1 thing or 2 things be the goal that you'd like the group to improve on that you didn't hear in the sound. Then when they do that, you tell them, you give them some feedback, and that sort of thing. And so that's where we need to kind of jump in with our, you know, up to waist high in the proverbial water, because, you know, that's the task that you have as a conductor that's more real. So on Thursday's class, I'd like you to start that process. What that means is you need to have things written into your score. And even if we end up, I've decided that for this experience, we're just going to sing unison. I don't want to put up with somebody having COVID one day and we don't have any tenor because the tenor's conducting, and we don't have, you know, that kind of thing. So it'll just be unison so that we have sound. I may decide to play with the group lightly so that there's a sort of carpet of 4 parts on the piano. But the point is that you'll have sound to conduct. I'll also give you 7 more blank copies of America the Beautiful, each of you. So I'll put 6 back to back, and then I'm going to give you another clean copy for yourselves. You still have one, right? Everybody still has one. So you have something you can bring for Thursday. But on Thursday, I'll give you those 7 copies. I'll put the 6 together stapled, back to back. And the reason for that is so that you can mark for whomever is conducting. You mark a new copy, like, okay, this is Dira's score. So you just keep that copy for her. You keep Julio's copy, etc. So you're not continually, you know, it'll take about 2 times with people up here, and you'll have an unreadable score. And then you can also make changes to your score, because that's also something we're going to do. You're going to conduct for a while the way you've got it marked at present, and then you're going to completely start all over again and do something completely different. So that's what to expect for Thursday, okay? And so the only, I want you to be able to remember, for example, for our final, I would like you to be able to spit back to me on paper or on virtual paper, or however we do it. What are the 4 effort actions? In other words, space, time, weight, and flow. And what are their continuums? Okay. And then name the 8 action verbs. But you don't have to define the 8 action verbs. All you have to remember is the 8 of them and what are they. Because I'll probably put that in a matching. So you'll say, okay, there's the definition of it. But it's so that you retain that aspect and you can have a conversation, for instance, with Dr. Cox at some point about, oh, yeah, I do know the basic idea of these effort actions. And I do know that in a kinesphere, these 3 dimensions are primarily used because that language will always relate to conducting. However, we're not going to do much more labeling of, I'm not going to say, now show me a float, show me a press. But I may use that language to say, well, could you show a little bit more like a pressed resistance? And then there's some context to our language. So just want to be clear, we're not now suddenly becoming Le Bon terminologists. We are now going back and using our pattern and space and ICTY and preparations and all of that, pattern frame, but with, I think, enlightened understanding of, okay, those concepts make some sense. That we live in a 3-dimensional space and our singers are going to see us making gestures in that 3-dimensional space. And if I want leggero, or you want legato, or you want a kind of accented attack, there's an onus on us to show that. There's an onus on us to describe whatever the articulation, whatever the structure is with a conducting gesture. I hope that relieves you to a certain degree so that if you thought, where is this going? It's a little bit more reasonable, I think. It's just to get us to the point where we can talk about things like resistance or why, for instance, in a slow piece of music, you're going to find that the choir flats. In a fast piece of music, you're going to find that the choir rushes. And that can be, you can't fix it all with gesture. But the manner in which we as conductors use our space assists the group with those basic elements. So if my gesture is pressed and tense, and we're singing something that is a cappella, light and soft, there's a good chance that choir will go out of tune. So these are very practical, I hope, discussions for. All right, I think we're caught up where we need to be for next class, and so just for now, just worry about what we're singing for each other. We're providing a melody, and I'll fill out the chord from the piano. Okay. Yay. Thank you. Hey Orla, did you get all that?
Yes, thank you.
Is it good? Did you get all that?
Yes, thank you.